Number 10. Oak Boys. What if I told you that Druids might not have called themselves Druids? I know, I'm blowing your mind right now. The word Druid technically just translates to oak knower, as the Druids were fond of trees. I mean, they kind of based everything around that. Especially of the oak variety. This is what the Romans translated it to when they were trying to understand the weird tree people. At least that's what we think, as not much is known about the Druids. None of the Roman writings ever describe the Druids as priests or practicing religion, so it's technically not a religion. The popularity of Druid-like religion is more of a modern invention. Yeah, that's right. I'm looking at you people who do strange rituals in the park. Please don't hex me, I'm just trying to make people laugh on the internet. I promise I'll compliment you later. Number 9. Julius Bias. Okay, so maybe even the Roman and Greek text might be a little off. Honestly, just knowledge of the Druids themselves is unusual, as the Greek and Roman texts were probably second or even third-hand accounts. Some of the more concrete information comes from old 27 stab wounds himself, Julius Caesar. So again, you kind of see how things could get a little muddy. Also considering the fact that the Romans didn't like Gaul very much. The most critical information we have comes from a group that wants to eliminate said group. That's like me writing an essay for the Schoolyard Bully. Hi, my name is Schoolyard Bully, and I'm a big, dumb, stinky, mean boy. And I think Big Chet is the most handsome and funniest host on the whole wide world and internet. Signed, Schoolyard Bully. See how easy that is? See, you can just do whatever you want. History is written by the victors. Number 8. Gender equality. Honestly, it's refreshing to hear nice things happening in history, especially when it can be so grim. So I'm happy to tell you that Druids were unusual in their treatment of women because they actually treated them better than all of Europe. Druids allowed women to be leaders, military leaders, judges, and honestly were just very unique compared to the rest of Europe. They were allowed to divorce when they wanted without losing a large amount of reputation or anything that would just bring a girl down. However, it wasn't all Victoria's Secret and Chanel No. 5 for the ladies, as there was still some male patriarchy lingering about, and their lives were still somewhat controlled by their husbands. Close though, we're getting close, getting close. Number 7. Midlife crisis. This one's kind of generalized because if I didn't, I'd have to mention almost every king ever. So here we go. Back in ye olde times, the access to better healthcare just wasn't there. Doctors aren't washing hands. Imagine, Buddy eats some greasy mutton and then says, "Alright, time for your enema." But those aren't the only greasy hands around certain orifices I'm talking about. I'm talking about kings marrying older girls at the ripe age of 12. Yep, that's right. Nothing says experience in womanhood like being 12. People didn't live long, and oftentimes these arranged marriages had ulterior motives, like alliances or business really. However, that does not make up for marrying a 12-year-old who may or may not have started those super weird changing times, like when you were 12 and now there's hair showing up in places that you didn't know there could be hair. I sent a courier to the chief and he came back with this message. It ain't it. Number 6. Till death do us part. Love and marriage go together like a horse and carriage, but sometimes the crooning words of Frank Sinatra aren't enough to keep people in love. Sometimes marriages end up like the ones we see on sitcoms, but when there's no laugh track, it's not very funny, and sometimes divorce is the answer. Medieval Germans thought this too, and something they practiced was divorce by combat. Basically, the man goes into a hole with his arm tied behind his back and the woman is free to move around with a sack of rocks. These proceedings are strange, as I'm sure no husband or wife married today would ever get so frustrated with one another that they would want to hit one another on the head with rocks. Oh, the blessings of being married. Number 5. Domestic disturbance. William the Conqueror was one down bad dude. The illegitimate ruler to the throne left a bad taste in some people's mouths, and was just as ruthless in silencing those rebellions that were always uprising against him as he was with the famous battles he was a part of, like the Battle of Hastings. But what I think he should be remembered by is the way he asked Matilda to marry him, or rather the extreme measures he took when she refused his advances because he was an illegitimate leader. William dragged Matilda by the hair out into the middle of the street and beat her until she agreed to marry him. I don't have to tell you how messed up that is, and I sure hope I don't. Number 4. Nero Sauna. The Romans were kind of a big deal, especially if you're into history. Large city, culture, and some other structures are still around today. That's kinda cool. But while the city of Rome may have been the best city on earth at the time, Romans themselves could use a little work. Meet Emperor Nero, the vicious leader of Rome who became emperor through ill-gotten gains. However, in what may have been one of the first acts of flexing the male patriarchy, the divorce or forced separation of his wife Claudia Octavia comes to mind. It was a rocky marriage from the start. There was a general dislike from the very beginning, but when Nero remarried, as emperors did, he had Octavia banished to an island, where shortly after she would be suffocated in a hot vapor bath. Her demise was sad for most Romans. Oh yeah, and they tried to make it look like she did herself in. That's messed up, man. Number 3. Wickerman. Would I really be talking about an ancient civilization if I wasn't talking about a preferred punishment that's so creative and horrifying it'll leave you up at night, or make you look at a wicker basket twice before having a picnic? Basically, you build a large man cage-like structure so you can jam in as much people as possible, and in some sort of sick and twisted Nicolas Cage-fueled monologue, you set ablaze the statue full of people that need to be unalived, because sure. Well, that's how the story went in Roman texts anyway. Historians today believe that this may have actually been Roman propaganda, as the surviving Celtic and Druid texts don't seem to mention anything of a giant Burning Man or Nicolas Cage for that matter. Number 2. Jedi knowledge. I just had to fit in another Star Wars reference. I mean, come on, it's Star Wars. But what's unusual about the Druids is that 2 of the Jedi is studying. And I'm not talking about 3 a.m. I have an exam at 8 kind of studying. I'm talking Druids often started very young and slowly learned the way of the Druids. Like mentioned before, they were healers, leaders, advisors, and conducted religious rites. But it took a lot of time and training to become one. This is part of the reason why very little written language was passed down, as their knowledge and teachings were considered to be too sacred to be written down. Just like the Jedi, they even helped mediate between Celtic tribes. Well, Jedi did more negotiations with aliens than Celtics, but you get the idea. Number 1. Return of the Druid. Usually when I go through a top 10 list, it's me talking about all kinds of lovely things humans have done to each other. Looking back, we were kinda crazy. I'm still stunned from learning about Vlad the Impaler. That guy's just really messed up. But it is comforting to know that in modern times we no longer have plague, evil, and people unaliving each other over land disputes. That was an attempt at comedy. There's also a point where I'll say gladly we don't do this anymore. But as it turns out, Druids have made a comeback. You don't have to worry though, it is a lot tamer version of what they used to be, or so they say. Modern Druidism has been described as a nature venerating movement. So, because many Druids view nature as sacred, they tend to have environmentalist beliefs that involve them in protecting nature from development and pollution. See, there's the compliment I was talking about. Way to go, guys. Thanks for protecting the trees. As for ceremonies, they are done at locations that just ooze Druid energy, like Stonehenge, where everything is just fine with the trees, the breeze, the snails, and the whales. Number 10. The end of an era. 1914. A super important dude in Sarajevo got capped in the back of his convertible. Some people are super cool about this, and others are not so super cool about this. So uncool in fact that they want to try out all the new fancy weapons and gadgets from the state-of-the-art technology that they've been stockpiling for years. The Ottomans, seeing that their empire was in a decline, saw an opportunity to solidify their place in Europe, strengthen their empire, and maybe just take some stuff from weaker countries. I hear Arabia has lovely sand and oil this time of year. So, how do we achieve victory, some Ottomans thought to themselves. It makes most sense to really join the stronger side, so that way we can almost guarantee our victory and be sitting at the right end of the negotiation table. Germany, Austria, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire would form the Central Powers during the First World War. It went very well for the Central Powers for about 5 minutes, before the whole thing went cow udders up. Germany was bogged down in the east and the west, Austria was having a difficult time with the Russians, the Ottoman Empire learned that building railways through someone else's country to take their stuff isn't very cool. When the smoke settled, the once mighty and powerful Ottoman Empire dissolved. Hundreds of years of great wealth and conquest gone within a few short years after World War I had ended. It's almost as if they shouldn't have gotten involved in the first place. Number 9. Execute Order 66. When you get big like the Ottoman Empire, you need protection. You need something that's really gonna protect you. The United States has the Navy SEALs, the British has the Special Air Service, and I have a collection of 80s movies that's so nerdy it protects me and chases off any cute girl who comes near me. But the Ottomans were thinking ahead by introducing the Janissary Corps, a unit of elite troopers who were the first modern standing army in Europe. Paid regular salaries, disciplined, and was one of the first militaries to have extensive use of firearms. Completely loyal to the Sultan, the Janissaries were a formidable fighting force. What happened to the Janissaries, I hear my bumblebees asking? Well, it's not so nice. A messy political climate was going to disband the corps. Not liking the replacements coming in after the Janissaries, they revolted, which led to something known as the Auspicious Incident, where the barracks burnt down and 4,000 Janissaries lost their lives.
Any remaining Jedi were hunted down and destroyed.
Sorry, I meant Janissaries. Watched too much Star Wars in preparation for Boba Fett. All jokes aside, that was pretty cruel. You shouldn't burn people down like that, man. Not so cool. But the comparison between the two, it's there. Star Wars is cool. Number 8. Where art thou, brother? Kings will be kings, and the male patriarchy will be the male patriarchy. You want your dynasty to continue? Then you need a male heir. Like most European kingdoms, this is just how it goes. The Ottomans were no different, except maybe their version of the royal family game. See, the Ottomans like to compete for the throne, meaning if you got brothers, you're gonna have to fight them for it. But not like the fight over the Xbox controller. No, these brothers would be fighting for life or death, oftentimes and having a lot of bloodshed in order to determine the next ruler. In one extreme case, one sultan had his infant brother strangled to make sure his spot on the throne was secured, which is totally a normal human, kind-loving thing to do. I'm happy to say we no longer do this. Number 7. How did they get those stones there? These rock formation to ever be built, besides the Easter Island heads and maybe Mount Rushmore if you ask a geologist, is Stonehenge, a giant circular rock formation thought to have been constructed by the Druids for all kinds of nerdy rituals. Or maybe not. It's actually been speculated that the rocks were constructed long before the Druids were running amok. However, I think the real question is, how did they get the rocks there? Think about it. Pyramids make sense. You keep building high until you get to the top and you get tired. But to put those rocks on top of each other like that, those stones were likely gathered from somewhere else. Stonehenge might be the most famous, but there are actually other similar sites as well. So how do you think they were built? Druids? Aliens? Or was it druid magic? Ooh, spooky. Number 6. No tax. Like previously mentioned, Julius Caesar wasn't the biggest fan of the Druids, Gaul, or pretty much anyone that wasn't Roman. I mean, come on, can you blame him? I'm just kidding. But one interesting thing Caesar does mention in his most likely biased writings is that the Druids didn't pay taxes. Being an intellectual class, the Druids were exempt from military service and paying taxes. And we all know how much Romans love their taxes. But can you blame the Druids? I mean, besides roads, education, public health, and sanitation, what have the Romans ever done for us? Gosh, this understanding of their culture did not make the Romans any nicer to the Druids. Number 5. Pickled foes. The Celtic and Druid had this really unusual tradition, or maybe it was something more sinister than that, really, not sure what to call it, but basically, they liked head. I mean, come on, who doesn't? You got eyes, you got a nose? Don't even get me started on those earlobes. I love a good earlobe. Everyone loves a good earlobe, but all bad innuendos aside, they like to keep heads of their enemies. Because, actually, it was because they believed the soul was in the head and not the heart. Which, yeah, I guess that kind of makes sense. Imagine a home decorated with all of your favorite heads. After realizing that severed heads can kind of ruin the feng shui of your home, and not because that's a head, but because body parts tend to rot, they began to preserve them in cedar oil. Which is just how I want my house to be full of jars of sticky severed heads. At least the cedar smells nice. Number 4. A 0-word essay. Since I hate essays so much, and you know how much I struggle reading, maybe I would have loved it with the Druids since they banned written language, or the passing down of written language to be exact. This is pretty much why not very much is known about the Druids, and the rumors of them being sorcerers certainly doesn't help. Imagine for a second, if you will, if we never had certain literatures passed down. For me, there's only one book that I'm glad got passed down, and you know the book I'm talking about, the holiest of books, the book with all the answers, Twilight. What would the early 2010s be without Bella and a very compelling story about vampires? Oh, and by the way, I'm Team Edward, just saying. Number 3, Jailhouse King. So eventually people in the Ottoman Empire were not okay with brothers impersonating Abel and Cain. After all, this bloodshed is rather pointless. There's gotta be a better way to choose the next ruler of this empire, and still keep everyone alive. How about house arrest? The solution to solve the next heir and to have brothers not be unalive was to keep them in cafes. No, not coffee shops, lavish prisons for princes to be exact. Cafe literally translates to cage, and it's where the heirs spent their time locked up, away, safe from harm. Not allowed to leave, but allowed to have female visitation if you catch my drift. It sounds like a good idea, but locking up somebody for long periods of time, then expecting that person to rule a country that they barely know or seen is kinda messed up. Also, no streaming services and Wi-Fi would make that the worst day ever. I'd give this place 2 stars, man. Number 2, impressive run. Okay, yeah, the Ottomans did some messed up stuff. I called the chief again last night, and he said it wasn't it. But that goes for all civilizations of the past. What's really messed up though is how long the Ottoman Empire lasted. From medieval times to the earliest 20th century, which is pretty close to the modern era. Over 600 years of conquering the Balkans, Middle East, North Africa, and the Caucasus. Like I've said before, you don't get that big and powerful without breaking a few eggs to make your omelets along the way. I am generalizing, but the Ottoman Empire was one of the most powerful empires to ever exist, and one of the longest. Encompassing roughly 20 million square kilometers at its peak, had a population of 35 million citizens. Number 1, a man you can trust. Okay, so room full of scantily clad women has to be protected, right? I mean, come on, who's gonna help? You need someone strong, obviously, but you also need somebody you can trust. Someone who will not fall for their devilishly good looks and try to take one of those wives away from your harem. Good thing the Ottomans had eunuchs on speed dial, or rather just had a lot from pillaging other nations and just kind of kept them around. But as silly as it might sound, it does make sense. How could a man be tempted to bed with a woman if he's missing his long John Silver? Right? Number 10, cold as the wind blows. Japan, we love the people, the food, the culture, and the samurai, because let's be honest, armored gentlemen of high morals with really sharp swords is just cool. Kublai Khan, being not as cool as Japan, said to himself and his massive ever-growing army, "We should go get some cool from Japan." And go to get cool they did. While some initial boat crossings and evasions went okay, to very notable instances where it did not go very well for the Mongol invaders. The worst incident being on August 12, 1281, with a combined fleet of 4,400 ships, over 140,000 Mongol warriors were ready to invade, when seemingly a large typhoon came out of nowhere and devastated the Mongol forces, with at least half of the men drowning and only a few hundred ships remained. Casualties were very high. Those that made it to shore were hunted down by the 40,000 samurai awaiting battle. Shortly after, the typhoon was dubbed the Divine Wind and was thought to be a gift from the gods. Holy for Japan, unholy for the Khan. Number 9. Ninja vanish. Samurai are distinguished by their colorful leather armor, and katanas that are forged with great care, and a code of honor that was upheld at all costs. But they were not the only warriors of ye olde times in Japan. The ninja needs no introduction, but here it goes anyway. Stealthy warriors cloaked in black who were hired for tactical espionage, and a really weird movie with turtles eating pizza with a rat. They were mercenaries hired by daimyos, and even samurai to get the misdeeds of war done. Sabotage and assassination were necessary in the rebellious and political climate Japan found itself in. It would see many political shifts and leaders fighting for control of a unified and fractured Japan. Number 8. My eyes! As previously mentioned, the ninja were stealthy warriors who did the dirty jobs no one else could. Specifically samurai, as the Bushido Code literally forbade them from it. And honestly, they were kind of high sniffing their own farts, as they felt a lot of things were below them, including ninjas. I for one would not want to disrespect such a worthy foe. What the ninja lack in a full military force or simply being in a traditional battle, they make up for it with their tactics and weapons. Equipped with a variety of weapons with a variety of uses, the most unholiest weapon in the ninja's arsenal was the Mitsubishi egg, not to be confused with Mitsubishi. A small container of sorts that held dirt and dust that when used would blind and disorientate the enemy. The worst flavor of this egg being filled with crushed glass. Yeah, crushed glass in the eye. It caused excruciating pain and would be quite difficult to deal with medically at the time. Honestly, who throws glass in eye, right? Number 7. The Air Factory. Now this makes sense when you think about it. Ottomans had siblings duking it out in the streets and cradles because of harems. Relax, late night users of the internet, it's a little bit different than what you think that means. Okay, yes, it was a room full of women and ladies of the evening, but these women actually held some political power. An example of this is an extremely influential time for these women that became to be known as the Sultanate of Women. Mothers of sultans often helped choose women for their sons, which I'm sure is the worst blind date ever, and once the women were pregnant, they were no longer permitted to be with the sultan. That child, if born a son, would take a position with his mother in governing a province. There's a lot of rules to this thing, and pretty messed up, but I think if there's something to take away from this, like we should do with all history really, is when you make the succession of your country messy, the politics get messy, and when that happens, you're at the risk of revolution. Number 6. Classic humanity. Here I am again talking about YouTube's least favorite S word. I'm here to give you the buzz in history, and that's just how it goes. Probably the worst invention that we've ever come up with since war, but alas, it happened, and it happened in the Ottoman Empire too. It was pretty easy to get rich off the backs of those you whip. What's so messed up is how long it lasted. I'll give you a second to figure out how long. Go ahead. Guess what year it ended in? 1908. Yeah, they kept it going until 1908. While the anti-S-word movement had done their best to remove this heinous activity, it is speculated that it continued up until the 1930s, specifically the trade and sale of women for the deed of deeds. Now you know something's messed up when that outlives your empire. The Ottoman Empire was dissolved shortly after this during the First World War. Number 5. Semper Fi. Okay, you've traveled back in time, you said to yourself, hey, I played tons of video games. I love ancient civilizations. I too wish to be a part of a massing army where we will vanquish our foes and gallantly fought battles. Once we reign victorious, we shall celebrate with a feast of grandeur and wine to soak our troubled souls. I am so pleased with the display of the enemy's blood that I am not even going to bathe for a week. Au the contraire, my chivalry late night gamers. The Ottomans were quite the opposite. The Janissaries were an elite force, but the officers in the military had very strict rules. When setting up camps, there was to be no consumption of alcohol. A strict rationing and sanitation was to be very important. You'd think how tough being in an army like that would be? How far a little rest and relaxation will go. Come on, lighten up, guys. Number 4. The rifle or the pen. When the Ottomans had taken Constantinople, it was treated as an absolute win. And for the Ottomans, it kinda was. For every Christian still in the city, not so much. A lot of them were killed, or sold into the situation that Anakin Skywalker left Tatooine for. As their empire grew, they began to take children at a young age. And when I say take, I mean take kids that weren't exactly theirs to take in the first place and convert them to Islam. And give them 2 choices. You're either a politician or you're gonna be a soldier. The politicians surprisingly reached some higher levels of power, but now if this were me, I know I'd end up in the army. I was never too bright. This actually kind of makes sense though. The idea was to create an army of completely loyal soldiers to the Sultan and government bodies that everyone could trust. Cruel, but effective. Number 3. Stomach pains. If you know anything about Japanese history, you knew this was coming. No, not the Logan Paul incident, but seppuku, the tradition of unaliving yourself with the most pain possible. Look, you gotta give samurai credit. They follow that Bushido code to the T. I mean, I can't even commit to a good book sometimes. But as crazy as the tradition sounds to us, to the samurai, honor means everything. Often done when defeated or disgraced, it's a ritual knife to the belly, and see you soon in the afterlife, oh mighty emperor. The most well-known case of this was the tale of the 47 Ronin, who after being disgraced and avenging their master, were granted seppuku by the shogun. The story has been told in many plays and even some films. And number 1, artsy brothels. Geisha women wore beautiful kimono robes and were oftentimes mistaken for being courtesans. While in some cases that is true about geishas, they were more like me. Wait, what? All jokes aside, they were more humble hosts for these pleasure quarters, oftentimes entertaining men before the scandalous behavior occurred. This was a time of great cultural and artistic expansion in Japan. So these pleasure houses were legal. A lot of these women, while not having the same amount of freedom and choice as today, actually did have more than their European counterparts. Nice. Number 10. No one's ever really gone. You may have heard that said when losing a family member, a pet, or in the worst Star Wars movies ever made. Sorry, not sorry Disney, those are terrible. But perhaps there is someone who is never really gone. Genghis Khan. Yes, that's right. The ruthless Mongol warrior who conquered so much in his time that we're still talking about it today. So why is this big bad warrior still with us today? Well, that's because of DNA. Yeah, in his time there was lots of activities going on, besides the usual pillaging the village and unaliving those who oppose you. There were a lot of happy endings, let's say, and by that I mean forced non-YouTube friendly conduct bedroom happy endings. So much so that when a study was conducted back in 2003, 8% of men in Asia were thought to be descendants of the mighty man himself. 0.5% worldwide. That doesn't sound like a lot, but we're talking about millions of people here. Next time you go out, you may be brushing shoulders with the warrior's kin. Prepare for battle! Number 9. Henry again? Boy, it's really hard not to talk about this guy. But dude was kinda down bad for it. He's just most well known for his mistreatment of his wives, and by mistreatment, I don't mean getting into a fight over whether or not the toilet seat should be up or down and then having a very toxic argument in front of family members. No, because when Henry was upset with marriage, he wanted divorce, which honestly was kind of taboo for the time. Oh yeah, and he also beheaded 2 of his wives because that's how it goes. I know every couple has their issues to work out, but for most dads out there, having sun-drenched beer-fueled weekends, they never go beheading after that. Although, Dad's been staring at the lawnmower for a while and there's a lot of blades on that. Dad? While it is true King Henry VIII did behead 2 wives, he didn't do it to all of them. And at some points we're honestly quite pleased with his holy sanctity of marriage. Anyone who's ever been married can tell you how peaceful and sacred that bond really is. Number 8. The People's Princess. Okay, I know Prince Charles isn't exactly a king, but he is royalty and the man kinda did Diana dirty. That's a quick and half put together allusion to a Michael Jackson song for the English majors and the audience. Being royalty isn't easy. Being royalty in a modern age when paparazzi overwhelm you with lights and cameras just for a juicy piece of gossip like, when was your last bowel movement? Is it slow? Extra extra, read all about it, the princess is constipated. That's just not fun. So after Prince Charles and Princess Diana had been married for a few years, you can understand how excited the media was to find out about their marital disputes. "There was 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded," was a quote by Princess Diana that gave the media a field day. Sadly, Prince Charles was having an affair, and it wouldn't be too much longer that Diana would perish in a car accident that may or may not be organized by the royal family themselves. Nice. Number 7. You can't come in. Tokugawa Iemitsu was the big bad shogun in power. And when you're the big bad shogun in power, you get to make big bad decisions. He ushered in the beginning of the Edo period, one that would see Japan prosper for a while, but it did eventually decline. Perhaps the worst part of this time was Japan's isolation. Japan basically locked itself in its bedroom and with a roar of prepubescent rage told the world not to come into my room. Tokugawa forbade any Japanese ships from leaving and anyone from entering. The penalty for disobeying such rule was death. Japan was nervous at the time as many European nations were beginning to colonize. And if they could rip apart a dynasty like China, surely they would be next. This isolation period lasted over 200 years. And while the world moved on, Japan kinda stayed frozen in time. Of course, like most laws, they get broken, and on the southern tips of Japan's coast, there was some important trading with the Dutch, but we won't tell anybody. Number 6. Manifest Destiny. Looking back on history, the United States and Japan are probably most recognized together as being combatants of that one war with that weird mustache guy, whatever it was called. And that war ending in the worst party favor ever, honestly. But that wasn't the first time these 2 nations met. It was a beautiful summer day in 1853 when just off the shores of Tokyo Bay some strange ships came into view. They were American ships with cannons, and they came bearing gifts to the emperor. And a very real ultimatum that can be summed up as, "My friends, you have been closed for too long. Open for trade, or else be annihilated, then open for trade." After some time, the Japanese really didn't have a choice. They dissolved the 200-year order to be isolated. The Americans were looking for trade, but in truth, a large motivation for their forced opening of Japan was manifest destiny. God bless America. God bless them. Number 5. When in Rome. Having a large quantity of warships in your harbor with shiny new weapons and technology is bad for one's health. But worse than that, it puts you in a position to be colonized. And to be fair, there was a good chance of that happening. From multiple nations actually. So when given an ultimatum, it was time to make a decision. But perhaps this wasn't all bad. The Japanese actually came up with a rather good solution. What if we take all the new technology and run with it? Maybe it's time to colonize some places ourselves, thought a room full of people ready to overthrow the feudal government with modern technology. And that's exactly what they did. An event in Japanese history called the Meiji Restoration was just that. What's unholy about the whole thing is how fast they did it, restoring the imperial reign but at the same time making it a very modern one. Within a few years, it had become the most powerful superpower in Asia. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. Number 4. The Last Samurai. Japan went from feudal kingdoms to an imperial powerhouse maybe too quickly. Samurai for the longest time were a part of Japanese nobility. Swords for hire that became so rich and powerful that they essentially became the government themselves. So when the Meiji Restoration came about, the use of knights for hire really wasn't necessary with an imperial army and government. Tensions rose as a samurai rebellion had broken out. The samurai of the old world with traditional weapons, some firearms, and the new and powerful imperial Japanese army with modern weapons and lots of soldiers. After Imperial Japanese victory, Japan would shortly begin its expansion and colonization of Asia, taking the stage as a major world player. Number 3. Pedestal. I think in a healthy relationship, you ought to put your partner on a pedestal sometimes. Maybe your partner is drop dead gorgeous, a promising athlete, really enjoys collecting stamps. You go, little rock star, collect those presidential stamps. However, Emperor Caligula of Rome had some other ideas. He would literally put his wife, who he claimed to love, up on a pedestal stark naked and let his friends in the military gawk and glare at her. He would also say to her that he could end her life whenever he wanted and put a knife against her for no reason. Weird flex, but okay. This guy was awful to everyone as he tormented and unalived so many people. Well, you sure wouldn't want to see his face everywhere as he liked to do just that. Built statues of himself everywhere because after losing your family to his tyranny and looking at his wife, you need to know who's responsible for all this. That's messed up. Number 2. Duzong Duzong Duzong. That wouldn't really be a great fraternity name, would it? Well, the Emperor of Duzong of China would think differently, as when he was in charge, that's pretty much what the royal court looked like. Enough drinking to keep AA in meetings for 100 years, and enough ladies of the evening to... Well, I don't have a joke for this one, but there were a lot of them, trust me. Having massive parties like that and enjoying the company of other women is not how you respect your wife. To make matters worse, it seemed that too much partying may have been a bad thing, who would have thought? As what he made up for in a fun weekend he lacked in governing, as the Mongols were at his front door, or gate rather. Eventually, his empire would burn to the ground. All thanks to alcohol, and many women who laid down for their lives, literally. Number 1. Side piece. Look, I enjoy the company of a woman just as much as the next king sits on his throne. But in my opinion, once you find a wife, it's time to settle down, relax, no more crazy parties like Duzong. This is another generalization, but every king did this. Every king in the past has had mistresses, as if that is a totally okay thing to do to your wife and oftentimes the queen of your kingdom. I'm a reasonable guy, so maybe I can see having your side piece waiting in the wings to be stage center, but it's never one, is it? It's always multiple. Ladies of the past, all I can say is make sure you give birth to a boy and watch your back. They're coming for you.